Hi, everybody. Today's Monday, February 3rd, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Happy to be back.
Let's get started, Colonel, with the attitude of Donald Trump and his administration. Since he took power in the United States, we see a new manner coming out of Washington in which he tries to show that he's on offensive. He tries to manage the situation by force. We see that in Ukraine, with the situation in Ukraine. He's exaggerating everything in favor of Ukrainians or maybe NATO to find some sort to manage the situation in Ukraine. How do you see the manner on the part of Donald Trump? Is that going to help him? This the way that he's treating, he's trying to manage the crisis or the war in Ukraine?
Well, I think first of all, we have to understand that Donald Trump is not a pacifist. He doesn't want to have peace per se. He just wants to disengage the United States from this conflict. He has understood, and in that sense, it's a progress if we compare what we had a few months ago with the Biden administration. At least he understood that you can pour dollars and money and whatever in this conflict that will not help the cause. And in fact, this Ukraine conflict is a black hole in which you just pour resources without having any result or tangible result at the end, whether for us nor for Ukrainians. And I would say primarily for Ukrainians, because everything we see now is that, and I think everybody now agrees that Russia is reinforcing itself, has increased capabilities, while on the other side, you have Ukraine with decreasing capabilities and less resources to counter the Russians. As a result, and we are still in the same war of attrition we had 2-3 years ago. And the problem is that when you start waging a war of attrition, it's not a good idea to have this kind of war when you have less resources than your opponent. And I think that's what Trump has understood. And that's, I think, has to be put on his credit. Now, the problem is how to disengage. And that's where you have probably the problem. The sense that my understanding is that Trump, during the presidential campaign and all that, and until he went in office a few weeks ago, I think he underestimated the scope of the problem. He thought, and that was reflected, by the way, by some comments he made, that Russia was exhausted, and therefore it would be easy to come as in between the two and say, okay, guys, let's do peace. And so everybody is happy because Russian exhausted on the other side, Ukrainians also exhausted for other reasons. And then the US can play the role as the big guy who comes and make peace. And I think he has realized, Trump has realized that it's not the situation. We are definitely in a situation where the Russian position is improving every day, and the one of Ukraine is worsening every day. As a result, we probably need to have some result, otherwise Ukraine will simply disappear. And that's not completely absurd, even if we know that Russia never had in mind to occupy the whole of the Ukrainian territory, but because you have now a situation within Ukraine where you have a very strong opposition, even armed opposition against Zelensky, so we might, as a matter of fact, see the disparition of Ukraine as we know it, even if it's amputated from by the four region in the south and east of the country. So now I think Trump has realized that, and that's probably the reason why he tried to put pressure on both. He made pressure. You remember his tweet a couple of days ago where he said that he loves the Russians and he praised the Russians for having suffered so many losses in World War II. But at the same time, if Russia doesn't want to comply and try to open talks with Ukraine, he will feel obliged to have additional sanctions on Russia. And on the other hand, at the same time, I would say, he started to put a stop on aid programs towards a number of countries that's affected not only Ukraine, but in specifically Ukraine. Although here there are a lot of, we are somewhat in a gray zone, because if you read the decree that was signed by Donald Trump, the decree itself mentioned only new projects, not old ones. Then you had the directive that was produced by Marco Rubio that mentions even civilian aid. And then there is still an unknown about the military aid. But apparently it's so that new projects, civilian or military, will be stopped, and old projects and probably armaments that are currently moving or being transported towards Ukraine, this will not, or is not being stopped. This will continue, but new project will definitely be stopped. And about the financing, this is stopped. A civilian project, and we have mentioned, Alexander Mercouris and others have mentioned that at length regarding the impact on the media, on the overall economy of Ukraine. So this is a strategy, apparently, in my view, by Donald Trump to put pressure on both actors to press them into a negotiation process. Now, the problem is that sanctions will, even new sanctions, will probably not affect the Russians. Now, the EU has issued its 16th sanction package, including PlayStations and this kind of thing, meaning that we are really at the end of everything we can sanction on Russia. And that's to some extent, this 16th sanction package is almost a proof of inability to do something, because it shows that we are out of resources, out of idea, out of capabilities to put pressure on the Russians. And at the same time, by the way, in the European Union, it's also interesting to see that there are debates about reconnecting the energy supply to Russia, and even some moves to rehabilitate a Nord Stream and things. So we have contradictory move in the European Union, meaning that these sanctions that Trump is threatening Russia with, these sanctions are likely to have absolutely no effect on the situation. Meaning that Trump is now out of means to force the two parties. What he has still capability of pressuring Ukraine, because the problem in a negotiation process is not the Russians, it's the Ukrainians. And there are two problems. There is an institutional problem because uh, Zelensky is not in a capacity to engage discussions on the behalf of the whole of Ukraine. He's no longer the president. He's only acting president, if you want, but is not the legitimate president of Ukraine. And in addition to that, there is all the issue of the decree he signed on the 30th of September 2022, and it was published officially on the 4th of October, which is the date of entry into force of the decree. That's the 4th of October, preventing anybody, including himself, by the way, to engage in talks with Russia as long as Vladimir Putin is in office. The problem is that since Zelensky is not president, he cannot even abrogate the decree he took about this negotiation stuff. So we are in a kind of a vicious circle here. That's one aspect. And the second is that there is still a very significant portion of the Ukrainians who will not accept to have any kind of negotiation with Russians. And that is, in fact, there are fewer and fewer people in Ukraine who think that.
You mean in the government, or you're talking about the Ukrainian people?
I'm talking about the population, and probably if we can have, I can show you here just this chart here that was made by the Kiev Institute of Sociology. And you can see that between May 2022 to December last year, you have a shrinking portion of the population who is ready to continue the war. And if we go to this idea of making peace by accepting to lose territories, it's a very similar pattern. You have less and less. You have roughly half of the population today who would say that under no circumstances we should lose territory, or let's say have peace at the cost of losing territories, while an increasing portion of the population would accept to lose territories in exchange of peace. So this is the situation. The problem is that in this 50% of the population, and it's a very similar amount here about those who want to or ready to endure the war. In those 50%, you have the supporters of Zelensky, and that explains why Zelensky is in fact blocked by his own decree and his institutional position. But on the other hand, the only support he has now is by those who don't want to have peace. And therefore, that means that he will be somehow protected, or he could stay in power as long as he pleases those guys. And that's where you have this very strange situation in Ukraine. And we see that Zelensky is resisting U.S. pressure to engage into talks. I think there will be a point at which there will be no space for him to resist this pressure, because the Ukrainian army is being decimated at this stage. More and more people are just deserting. and you have more and more, let's say, the Russians are more and more effective in destroying key objectives. When I say key objectives, definitely you have those objectives like uh, power stations and the static objectives that you can detect and locate through satellite imagery and things like this. But now you have an increased capability of the Russians, thanks to the resistance that does exist in Ukraine itself, the ability of the Russians to detect grouping of individuals. For instance, when you have officers or staff gathering for some meeting and prepare operations, things like this, or foreign fighters or foreign officers or military advisors and things like this. Now they are able to locate that and to destroy them. We had recently a couple of examples of that. So meaning that we'll reach a point where Ukraine will no longer be able to function simply. I mean, the military will not function, but also the economy. In addition to that, Zelensky made the mistake to cut the gas, meaning that there's absolutely no gas flowing from Russia to Ukraine. And Ukraine is now obliged to buy gas back from Europe. So, and Europe has already a shortage of gas. So we are Ukraine is an extremely difficult situation. And Ukraine, for instance, receives electricity or power from Slovakia, and they cut the gas to Slovakia. So Slovakia doesn't want to provide power anymore. So, the situation, the political, diplomatic, strategic, geopolitical, and military situation of Ukraine is degrading every day. In addition to that, we have, and that's the result of the Trump policy or way to address the problem. Trump tried to fulfill its promises through kind of aggressive posture. We have seen that with Canada and Mexico. Suddenly now they decide we put 25% tariffs. Same with China, same with Europe, and the pressures for Greenland, the pressure on Panama. We have now a kind of a strategy of pressure that is being used by Donald Trump to fulfill the promises he made during the presidential campaign. And that starts to have adverse effects in the Western camp. It's interesting because a few months ago, some people were saying that NATO and European Union will get reinforced through the conflict in Ukraine and through the operation of Russia. And as I have said many times, in fact, exactly the opposite that has been demonstrated in the last year. First of all, we see today that there is a difference of vision between, and of course that's because of Trump coming into office, but we have a division between the Europeans and the US, meaning that NATO to some extent is split on the question of how to address the Ukrainian question. That's the first aspect. And within Europe itself, you also have this split. You have those who think that, and not just Hungary or Slovakia with Viktor Orban and Fico, that advocate the idea of having a political settlement for the conflict. But now you have more and more other countries that think that we need to shift gear with the with this conflict. And you still have a hardcore countries, which are namely Poland and the Baltic states, essentially, with probably Germany, although Germany is also softening its position, also because you have problem within Germany itself. They will have, in a couple of weeks from now, they will have the legislative election, meaning that you still have this hardcore countries that are still struggling to keep pressure on Russia in every way, and other who think that probably we should have a realpolitik or a realistic approach to the conflict. So we see that now we have this split, and again the split and reinforcement of NATO. As I said already last year, we have seen the first cracks as European countries had to make bilateral agreements with Ukraine instead of relying on the capabilities of NATO. I mean, Ukraine is a partner of NATO, as Switzerland is, for instance, because it's part of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership. And we could have expected that through this partnership, you might have some help flowing from NATO to Ukraine. But that's not exactly what happened. They had to create other structures, bilateral structures, through bilateral security agreements to achieve the support to Ukraine. A lot of those agreements are still confidential, so we don't know exactly the content. But that means that basically that showed that NATO was not in a position to solve the question, and to solve the question of the problem of Ukraine. So something more, or something they had. I mean, NATO had to be complemented, not even supplemented, but complemented by something else. And that these are the bilateral agreements. So we see that, in fact, and I'm not even mentioning all the problems that are induced by the sanctions taken by Western countries that backfired on their own economy and generate the problem we have now. So now this conflict has shown the weakness of NATO as an alliance, has shown the weakness of NATO countries as countries, because they were not able to join their forces into a consistent support for Ukraine. And it also showed the weakness of Europe, that in fact engaged into kind of economic warfare with Russia without having the capabilities of doing it. And I would say that there is an overarching problem here. This is the way the Westerners assessed Russia in 2022. And that, in fact, is the starting point of everything we are seeing crumbling now. Because in February 2022, as the European Union, NATO, and everybody was contemplating the idea, starting, in fact, to implement sanctions against Russia, they came with the idea that Russia was weak and could not be able to sustain these sanctions for a very long time. And that this failed assessment at the very beginning of the whole process is exactly what we see today. We see the result today. It's not starting today, but people start to realize today that is. Those who had eyes open 2 years ago could identify this, and I think it was on my book on the Operation Z already in October 2022, because it was obvious that the West was basing its strategy on assessments that were not relevant for the situation, and with a strong underestimation of the enemies, meaning that the sanctions we took in 2022, as an example, uh, were were addressing or were tailored to address a country that was already strongly weakened. And where Russia weakened to the point that it was in the assessment of the Western country, then we could have a completely different outcome. But it's not what happened. I mean, we were, in fact, what the Westerners did was wishful thinking. And today, everything, the reality comes to the surface, and we are, I mean, that's the problem of all our government. They are not trying to confront reality. And all the name of the game today is how not to lose face. This is the only issue. So Trump has, I think, understood that. And that's the reason why he doesn't want to be in this conflict anymore. And whether or not after 100 days or more, he will say, okay, if you don't want to settle your conflict, that's fine. Bye-bye. I give the baby to the Europeans, and they have to manage the issue since they want war. And in fact, the Europeans resisted any attempt to have a negotiation. And they resisted even more than the Americans. We have to remember that in early November 2022, I think, or 23 at least, I may be wrong, probably 23, sorry. The US started to advise Ukraine to consider the idea of talking to the Russians, meaning that probably the US intelligence at that point assessed that somehow the war was already lost, and it could be probably better to engage into some kind of negotiation with the Russians before Ukraine could be defeated. Today, since nothing happened since
we had General Milley talking about this, if you remember.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Well, and that was in the press. I mean, I think New York Times said you had articles on that in early November 2023. The problem is that nothing happened, in particular because the Europeans were not willing to support such kind of a move. And the problem is that today the events are such that they will be forced into a negotiation. So it's no longer a negotiation by choice, it's a negotiation by obligation. Had the Ukrainians started negotiations 1.5 years ago, then it would be by choice, and their position would have been much stronger. But today, it will be a negotiation from a position of weakness. And therefore, if the problem, Europeans have pushed Ukraine in a situation, this is where Ukraine can only lose more than it can lose. This is terrible. And all that is, in fact, a large part of that is the consequence of the position of the European Commission. And of course, European politicians, they started to believe in their own narrative. You know, that's the whole thing. The Ukrainians, with the help of the British mostly, they started to develop this narrative of victory, that Ukraine cannot lose, that Russia must lose, that Russia will lose, and that Ukraine is much stronger, has less casualties than the Russians, and. But this was a totally fabricated narrative that fed our media And this narrative was, in fact, instrumental in making European politicians to believe that there was a possibility of success for Ukraine. And that's, in fact, the European Union in particular pushed Ukraine into the catastrophe, or exactly at this point. So now people start to realize that and are in a kind of damage limitation mode, if you will. How can we avoid a total collapse? And since Ukraine has not many cards in hand, that means that Russia has the upper hand. And therefore, Russia says, well, okay, we are ready to talk, but that will be on our terms. And that's exactly what Trump is discovering now. That all the issues, and Keith Kellogg had its suggestion that he published last year in an article that he co-authored with another guy, I don't remember the name. In any case, and it was kind of trying to find solution to the conflict. And today, even Keith Kellogg, I think, understands that he didn't get it at that last year, and today making peace without making concession to the Russians will be extremely difficult. And the more you go, the more time goes, the more you will have to work under Russian terms, period. The Russians have less and less incentive to make any concession. The more you wait, the less the Russians are prone to make concessions. Therefore, that's what Trump is discovering. And that's why nobody talks anymore about peacekeepers, about demilitarized zone and Korea solution and things like this. Because all that could have been a solution had Russia experienced more problems than it did. But the fact of the matter is that Russia didn't want to proceed on the ground quickly, because the purpose of the Russians is not to take territory. The purpose is to destroy the Ukrainian potential. I remind you the two objectives that were defined or declared by Vladimir Putin on the 24th of February 2022, demilitarize, denazify. This is, we can talk about the terms in themselves, but the essence of the message is that what we aim at is to destroy a potential, not to gain territory, meaning that we don't need to move quickly through Ukraine. We just wait for them, and that's exactly what General Surovikin said in October 2022. We don't aim at making big advance on the ground. We will just keep the life of our soldiers, if you want, and we'll wait for the Ukrainians and we'll destroy them as soon as they come. So the name of the game is the destruction of the potential. This is very Clausewitzian in essence. And that's exactly what the Russians are implementing. So that's why they don't need to proceed quickly. And therefore, all that, by the way, even the issue of stalemate, and I think even Marco Rubio in a recent interview with Megyn Kelly, he said that it was a mistake to think that it was a stalemate. In fact, it was not a stalemate. The Russians are proceeding methodically, systematically, quietly, but they are like a machine. They're destroying the potential. And what the Europeans and the West at large has done is just to feed the machine. This is what we did. We just fed the machine by throwing Ukrainian soldiers into something that was designed to destroy them. That's why you have now Ukrainians start to realize that, and that's why you have so many desertion cases and things like this. So yes, we have now a situation where this is a matter of time. We know what the outcome will be. The problem is how big the damage for Ukraine will be, and who will pay for that. And again, Marco Rubio was suggesting that someone will have to pay for that. And if I can read behind the lines, I didn't have the feeling in his interview that he was suggesting that the US would pay for the damage. Ukraine wants to be part of the European Union. Fine, then the European Union will have to pay for that. So we still have a kind of budgetary struggle in the European Union to solve the issue, because the Americans now, and the reason why, and I think there is some kind of consistency in the way Trump is approaching that. Remember that the essence of the Trump doctrine, I could say, is to restore US power by rebuilding this industrial capability in continental US. And that's why you have words like stealing industries and things like this, stealing job and things, meaning bringing or reshoring companies, industries, employment and things like this. And that's what Trump wants to do. And he has understood what his predecessor didn't, is that waging wars across the globe, maintaining a huge military presence around the globe, is a waste of money, because you achieve nothing, you just create chaos, and you just spend money for something that brings nothing back. And that's probably the essence, as we can understand it at this stage, or as I can understand it at this stage, is that Trump would prefer to invest in reconstructing the industrial capabilities of US in the US themselves, rather than funding a military presence that in essence doesn't bring anything, not even security. So the Trump sees more the supremacy or the hegemony of US related to trade than to military power. And that's probably the significant change we are witnessing today. And that explains why the Trump asked its allies in the NATO allies to increase their defense spending, because at the end it doesn't want that the European security would hang on the in the U.S. military or military security. So it's kind of realistic approach to the problem, because as we have seen, and basically other probably seemingly unrelated issues, such as the issue with DeepSeek, and today you have this huge project that has been started by Chinese to have kind of outer space energy production system that will beam energy down to the Earth. Whether it will work or not, I don't know. But it shows that what happened with the policy that the different US government had in the last 25 years, they diverted a lot of money from research and development to military power. And that's exactly what Trump is trying to, let's say, moving back today, because he sees that we spend a lot of money having aircraft carrier around the globe and all that, but that doesn't improve things. Today, the security and is threatened by the lack of research and development, the dependency of the West to the East and China, namely, where China is not spending much on its defense, even if its own defense budget has increased, but it's still a peanut if we compare that to what the Western countries, including the US, are spending for defense. And the bulk of the spending in China is related to research and development relating to new technologies, other kind of alternative energy and all that. And for that reason, China has more and more an edge as compared to the West, and the West is losing its competitiveness, its ability to innovate, its ability to be competitive on the international market, on critical technologies and all that. And therefore, we may have stronger military, but we have a weaker strategic posture. And that was exemplified by the Oreshnik missile. The Russians, with a fraction of what we spend in the West, were able to develop missiles that can, in fact, bypass any air defense system. To some extent, DeepSeek is exactly the same thing, that the Chinese achieved the same or better result with less money. So we are here in a situation, because our economies in the West are based on financial engineering rather than on industrial engineering. And that has to be changed. So I think Trump has realized this. I am not sure the way he wants to solve the problem is the best one, but I think at least he realized this, and at least he is taking steps to solve the issue.
I think right now we are at a crucial point for the European Union and European countries, that they have to understand who's Europe in the mind of the United States. I'm not talking about Donald Trump or anybody else in power in the United States. At least Donald Trump is so honest about talking about how do they feel about Europe today. Here comes the question. They want to, we know the situation of the economy of European countries right now. They want to increase, as you mentioned, the defense budget from, Macron said that they can double their defense budget. Germany is not agreeing with the increase from 2% to 5%. On the part of Russians and BRICS, let's put it that way, BRICS is just expanding. On the other hand, the United States, G7, is trying to improve itself, but this improvement is going to happen in the United States, not in other countries, not in other part of this G7 countries. You don't see that happening in Europe. You don't see that happening in Japan. But the United States at least is trying to manage this situation. And when you look at the United States, and they're talking about that Europe is not even the first priority of the United States, not second and third. How do they feel? What do they want to be? And what would be the plan for the future? Because if they go with the plan of Donald Trump, it's all about the United States, it's not about the Europe and European countries. And nobody knows what is the main purpose of this increase in their defense budget. There is no threat coming from Russia and China combined. And why
Well,
do they need to do that?
well, first of all, we have to be clear on this difference between U.S. and the U.S. is doing better, but for one and simple reason, is because it's in fact the tool for U.S. hegemony and improvement at the same time is the use of the dollar. The dollar is the keystone of U.S. ability to improve. Now, and that's where you have the problem today with the BRICS. We have seen recently all the threats done by Donald Trump to have tariffs and sanctions, and if those countries of BRICS who don't want to use dollar anymore, they will have 100% tariff and all that. This kind of policy has as result that people will have been very cautious using dollar, and in fact it will have the opposite effect. I mean, the issue is that, as I said, Donald Trump wants to rebuild US. For that he needs money. To have this money, he will sell bonds. But now, if you are a foreign country and you are punished if you are not doing exactly what the US wants. Think about also the problem of freezing your assets and what you have provided to the US. It can be confiscated and all that. So what is your incentive to help the US by buying US bonds? Doesn't make any sense. That is, in fact, this kind of policy. That's why I said I'm not sure that Trump is implementing the right, I understand its intent, but I'm not sure he's implementing the right strategy to address the problem, because the effect now is that people get more and more cautious having some trade with the US, because then you can be sanctions, or your product will have tariffs. So that means, well, what's the point? So it's better to abandon completely the dollar so that the threat of Trump cannot reach you. So that's the first aspect. Second aspect is that, and those bonds are very important because they are, in fact, when we see the increase of the GDP of the US, it's basically the result of the money it received from selling bonds, in fact. So we have to understand that. I mean, the US economy is extraordinarily dependent on its currency, in fact. And that's one thing. Now, if we look at Europe, the Minister of Defense, you mentioned the increase of the defense budget to 5%. I think the Minister of Defense said that increasing from 2 point something to 5% means that the budget of the government would increase by 42%. Increasing the defense spending to 5% means increasing your budget, your defense budget, by 42%. That's enormous. That's almost half of the government budget. So, and we understand that, especially with regards to the economic situation and the competitiveness of German industry, Germany cannot afford that. In France, they are saying they will improve defense expenditure, but remember that the budget right now is a matter of discussion within the parliament, and some say that it might be the cause of a further collapse of the French government, because nobody can agree on the budget which is proposed, because today they have so many things to do that the budget is about squaring the circle, and that's almost impossible because everything comes at the same time. They have an increasing debt. The service of the debt is increasing every day. At the same time, you have societal issues like pension and all that has not been solved, and you have more. So there's always more problem to solve at the same time, and they have in fact kicked the can down the road so far, and today they are coming back to the reality. So we are in a situation in France. I'm not sure they will be able to double the expenditure, or it might be in defense expenditure, but probably in different, let's say, not directly in armament or things like this. Probably in subsidize some industries and all that. Now, France also, we have to remember, has another kind of challenges than Germany. You could see that in the last 6 months or so, the French armed forces were kicked out of several African countries, meaning that France has to resize its presence. It has now a minimal presence in Africa, and God knows for how long. Meaning that France has to rethink its defense policy and probably put aside its historical interest in being in Africa or things like this and concentrate on Western Europe. So I don't know exactly what they want to do, but probably it's probably a refocus on the French defense towards Central Europe as it used to be. I mean, it should be, probably not used to be, but well, it should be. In any case, we see that even France will have problems. All European countries have budgetary problems at this stage. And I don't know exactly how long it will take to solve this problem in the long run, because we have overspent money, in particular to help Ukraine. Again, we are claiming that we want to continue supporting Ukraine, but for how long and for which purpose? Because today everybody understands that, as I said about Trump, everybody understands that Ukraine is a black hole. So how long will European countries support that? Because at the end, what you give to Ukraine is something you don't use for your own economy. And without taking into account what European Union as an institution gives to Ukraine. And these are all billions of euros. Again, here, the money provided by the European Union comes from somewhere. And in essence, you also have to understand, if you look at the map of the European Union, you can draw a line, a vertical line between the old Europe, as the Rumsfeld used to say, old Europe, that's Germany, France, Italy, and so on, and the new Europe, which are the Baltic states, the former Warsaw Pact countries, Romania, and so on and so forth. Now, if you draw this line, you can put uh, right of this line, these are all net recipients of European funding. And on the left hand side, that means the old Europe, are the net donors for the other part of Europe. Meaning that you will have on the eastern part of Europe, you will have all these countries that were defined by Vladimir Putin as tabaki. This is the small guy that is jumping around on the Lion King, this cartoon, and he's always saying what the king says. This is just repeating that and just screaming but doing nothing, basically. And in fact, those tabaki who are advocating for supporting Ukraine, fighting against Russia, and all countries that are net recipients from Ukraine. Those meaning that when you have Estonia, Poland developing their armed forces, they do that largely with the money of European Union, which is paid by the old Europe, essentially. So you can see that here you also have, when we talk about European Union, we are talking about the money given by you. This money comes mainly from countries that have already today huge difficulties, budgetary difficulties: France, Germany, Italy, Spain. So I'm not sure that even the idea of supporting Ukraine, and not just a military effort, but also supporting Ukraine in the long run to reconstruct Ukraine and all that, I'm not sure this will be sustainable from the European side. And that may well lead to a more radical split within the European Union, because supporting or restoring the kind of Ukrainian economy or things like that will cost a lot of money. We have to understand that if we look the rhythm of advance of Russian forces in Ukraine, it may well be that in a few months they reach on the Dnieper on all its length, I mean Ukrainian length, meaning that essentially all the resources that used to be mineral or agricultural resources of Ukraine will be under Russian flag. And assuming, again, I have no idea, but assuming that Odessa will become or come back under Russian flag, then Ukraine will become a very tiny country without real access, I mean, landlocked, with no access to the resources it used to have. And therefore, to rebuild this country will be extremely expensive for the European Union. And that's where we are heading towards. And I'm not sure this is a perspective that I think the Europeans start to understand that, but they start only to understand that, which is quite astonishing, but that's the situation.
Colonel, we have Netanyahu in the United States. He wants to meet with Donald Trump. Here comes the question: what does Donald Trump have to offer him in terms of the way that the United States can help Israel in its ongoing conflict against Palestinians? And do you think that maybe Donald Trump would be able to convince him to understand the reality of what's going on in Gaza, in Palestine? Because after more than a year of the conflict, you see no sign of Hamas being Hamas been weakened tremendously, and at least we saw the forces coming out and they're managing everything. They're showing how they're in charge in Gaza. At the same time, you see the United States talking about the Palestinian Authority being in charge in Gaza, which doesn't make sense after all. After all of these casualties, all of these, uh, the genocide that has happened in Gaza, who's Palestinian Authority and who's gonna be in charge in Gaza? These are huge questions on the part of the Trump administration and how they gonna manage the situation in Gaza. And let's put it this way: what Donald Trump can offer to Netanyahu, and and what would be the future of the conflict in that region?
Well, first of all, I think, again, uh, I said that regarding Ukraine, but the same applies to the Palestinian issue. Trump is not a pacifist, and he's not a partisan of the Palestinians in any way. So he is clearly a supporter of Israel. Now, he knows that the situation we are witnessing today in Palestine has revealed all the crimes of Israel and all that. So probably he doesn't want to make, let's say, to demonstrate too ostensibly that he's pro-Israel in that sense. But in essence, I think the Palestinians do not have an ally with Trump. That must be clear. And the recent declaration of Trump that he could or he would try to convince Egypt and Jordan to accept those Palestinians and have these Palestinians resettled in Egypt and or in Jordan, which, by the way, this had been tried by the Biden administration, Anthony Blinken, more than 1 year ago. And this time again, that was refused by those countries. But again, Trump will try to support Israel, and for him, probably the best solution is where you have no Palestinians in Palestine, and that's it. Now, the reality is the reality, and since with everything we have seen, nobody wants or dares to go beyond what Israel has done or to support too ostensibly what Israel does. Probably the US will have a more conciliatory approach to the conflict. That means having a dialogue with the Palestinians. Now, the dialogue with the Palestinians is not a new issue. In 2006, as you had the elections that led to the victory of the Hamas in Gaza, the US, let's say, used the Palestinian Authority to try to topple the Hamas leadership and to regain power in the Gaza Strip, and that led to this intra-Palestinian conflict between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority is an entity that has a very ambiguous role because it's funded by the West and through Israel as well. And in essence, many said it's a kind of a puppet organization. This is not or structure or institution because they are not working in the interest of the Palestinians, but simply in the interest of Israel. And as a matter of fact, since the Palestinian Authority was instituted, that's all after the Oslo Agreement, This authority has never been able to stop, for instance, the settlements, the Israeli settlements in West Bank, for instance. And nobody made any attempt, in fact, to stop that. And today it has become a real issue because, well, we can give the value it has, but the fact of the matter is that the International Court of Justice has stated that every Israeli presence in the Palestinian territory is illegal. Every single one. And by decision of the General Assembly of last November or October or so, it was decided that every country has as an obligation to help Israel to leave the Palestinian occupied territory, which absolutely no Western country has even started to do. But by law, they should be obliged to do so. Made by yes, international law, because it's a decision of the General Assembly. So this is the problem, because after having not accepted the result of the vote or the elections in Gaza, they made Gaza kind of something exotic that is outside of the jurisdiction of the Palestinian Authority, even though some activities in the Gaza Strip are endorsed by the Palestinian Authority. For instance, when we talk about the number of victims, some say these are the Hamas figures. You know, when we talk about the 46,000 or so victims in the Gaza Strip, people say these are Hamas. No, it's not true, because this is done by the Ministry of Health of Gaza, which is endorsed by the Palestinian Authority, meaning that there is a kind of jurisdiction that extends somehow to the Gaza Strip. But at the same time, this jurisdiction is probably not powerful enough to make the Palestinian Authority the right interface between the West and the Hamas. That's the problem. So I'm not sure that the Hamas would recognize the authority of the Palestinian Authority if we have kind of a dialogue. At the same time, we have seen that it's possible to talk to the Hamas, because the ceasefire that is currently in force has been negotiated with the Hamas. So meaning that there is a point where probably here too, we should start to have a realistic approach to the situation and stop qualifying the Hamas as terrorist organization, and start to discuss with Hamas about the situation in Gaza, and having a situation where probably to have, if we can stop with this kind of qualification, then having new elections in the Palestinian territory and having a real authority that represents the interests of all Palestinians that emerge from that. Probably, I don't know. And then that would probably help the West to have more dialogue with the Palestinians. But one thing is sure, the Palestinians don't want to give up their claims on their territory, which is what we see on the map. I mean, the Gaza Strip and West Bank and East Jerusalem. This is the minimal claim of the Palestinians. Because if we look at the legal dimension of how Israel extended its presence in Palestine, you will see that there is not a single square meter that has been legally acquired by the Israelis since 1947. not a single square meter. So this is the problem, that we have a de facto country with provisional borders, because again, the borders of Israel are not even internationally recognized as a border. It's a ceasefire line, so-called green line. And so that's the reason why for the Palestinians, they're still talking about a provisional entity. But okay, let's put that aside and let's talk about, and I think the Palestinians, even the Hamas, has been very pragmatic about this. And they have recognized that their claim on Palestine can be limited to the Palestinian territory after the, let's say, or prior to the situation we had in June 1967, meaning that this is in essence the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So the Palestinians have already done a very huge step forward, accepting even the Hamas, because that was said at the time by Sheikh Yassin, who used to be the founder of the Hamas movement. And he said that they were ready to consider their claims limited to the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And that's a departure from a posture that was much more, let's say, demanding, and namely that the issue of the whole territory of Palestine should be renegotiated. I'm not sure this will be possible. Again, the problem is that the Israelis are trying to create some kind of what we say in French, a fait accompli. That means a kind of a situation that is frozen somehow by having the settlements, for instance, in the West Bank. And you have probably something like close to 1 million settlers in this part of the country. That makes almost this occupation almost irreversible. And unless you have a major conflict, that a major uprising in Palestine, that would then expel all these settlers who have no rights to be on these territories. So it's very difficult to see where things will develop. One thing appears to me clear is that exactly the same thing as the Ukrainian conflict, Trump doesn't want to be dragged into a regional conflict, and he wants to stop. I mean, he doesn't want to stop the U.S. support to Israel. This is not what he wants to do. But he definitely doesn't want to be dragged into something bigger, as Netanyahu would try to do, especially with regards to Iran. So we are in a situation where Trump is probably saying, if you want me to continue helping you, you have to abide by what I'm saying, and namely stop this conflict. And I'm not sure he will ask Israel to do more than this, because I'm not sure he's in a position to do that, and I'm not sure that Netanyahu has the ability to declare, for instance, that all the settlers should leave the West Bank. I'm not sure Netanyahu even could do that. That would create a situation in Israel itself, and probably a coup and things like this. So we are in extremely, in essence, we have a similar situation in Israel as in Ukraine. You have a government that has less and less credibility for the population, that has engaged in a conflict without a real strategy. I mean, a strategy based on reality, let's put it that way, assuming that the enemy was weaker than it is in reality. And in both cases, both in Ukraine and in Israel, You have a government that is now, how to say that? He cannot cope with the situation it created. And we are in both cases in the situation that endangers not just the institutions, government and things like that, but also probably even the life of the Netanyahu in Israel and Zelensky in Ukraine. So it is an extremely delicate situation where you have in both cases two countries that have engaged in desperate kind of strategies, destroying more than they were expected to do by underestimating the enemy. And today they are caught in their own trap somehow. And we have that exactly on both sides, on the both. It's very interesting to see, and as I say very often, the very strange because Netanyahu comes from Poland, the Smotrich comes from Ukraine, so you have the same guys in the two countries, the same mentality, the same ideology, everything exactly the same, and with the same desperate behavior, almost nihilistic behavior on both sides, that are ready to sacrifice their own nation for the sake of some kind of idea, and not even an idea, but some kind of wishful thinking somehow. So it's not even an idea. It's the denial of reality, and this is the base of the way they address the issues on both sides. So we are seeing on both sides exactly the same kind of defeat, and I think Trump has understood that. This is something, and to some extent, we can, of course, argue whether Trump has the right answer to these problems. But there is a slight progress if we compare with the Biden administration, in the sense that Trump has understood that there is a problem that goes beyond what we say. There are fundamental issues, and that the US is no longer in a position to solve these issues by itself. So it can only press on the actors to find a solution between themselves, but the US cannot propose. It's not a matter of money anymore. But of course, in Israel, Trump could stop delivering weapons. Okay. But this will not solve the problem. It will certainly contribute to stop Israel making war crimes and killing civilians and children and women. So that's for sure. But on the other hand, it will not solve the problem. And the essence of the whole problem is precisely that nobody tried to address the Palestinian issue. So probably Trump has understood that. He will, I don't know if he will try to make some pressure on Netanyahu to force Netanyahu to have, as he did for the ceasefire, to press them to engage into a discussion. Now, the ceasefire is also a step forward in a sense that it gives room for possible discussion, since you have now only the first phase of the ceasefire has been, in fact, or it has been negotiated and is being implemented. But there are two other phases or two other steps that needs to be A, negotiated, and B, implemented, meaning that there is still some room for discussion between the parties, and Trump may or could use this opportunity to force the two parties into something more kind of a long-term solution. I don't know. What he is, in Ukraine, I'm not sure he's willing to engage into a negotiation process that brings peace. He just wants to have a solution. He doesn't want to leave the theater without having tried to do something. So he's forcing the two parties to have a discussion. But at the same time, in Ukraine, for instance, Trump said, at the end of the day, it's Vladimir Putin who decides if the war is finished or not. Because he understood that the reality is there. This is up to the Russians to define this and no longer to the West or to the Ukrainians. And probably he has a similar position with Israel. The problem is that since Hamas is considered by the US as a terrorist movement, he cannot move further. So that's why all these terrorist designation and things like this are not very useful, because they tend to prevent dialogue rather than solving solutions. The fact that the US calls the Hamas a terrorist organization, or even worse, even if the Swiss government, for instance, defined the Hamas as a terrorist organization, in what sense does it help? In fact, it has absolutely no sense. Switzerland is not threatened by Hamas anyway. And the fact that you designate Hamas as a terrorist organization prevents you to start a dialogue with them or to mediate between Hamas and Israel. So, we to some extent, we tend to be prisoner of our own narrative on all these conflicts. And we said that at the beginning of this show regarding Ukraine, and we see exactly the same thing with Palestine. By using, buzzwords and punchlines to define the Hamas as terrorists and the 7th of October and all that, we see that with time the narrative crumbles, that everything we said was wrong about the Hamas, that all the crimes that we said about the Hamas were not true, that was simply part of the Israeli narrative that would allow then for the use of disproportionate response and all that. And in addition to that, the fact that we created this narrative prevents us to engage into negotiation. Because at the end of the day, how can you talk to someone who kills babies or decapitate babies? The problem changed when you see that the babies were never decapitated. The only one who acknowledged having decapitated babies are Israeli soldiers. So then how can you talk to Israelis now? So you see, this is the problem of using narratives and trying to wage wars through narratives. That's what we have seen in the last 25 years. Is fine as long as you can have decisive victory on your enemy, like with ISIS or something like this. But when you cannot achieve victory, then your narrative becomes your jail, because then you're not able to get out of that, and you are caught, and the narrative becomes exactly what denies you to solve the problem. And that's exactly where we are, both in Ukraine and in Palestine, which is a little bit sad to some extent, but it shows also the lack of ability of our governments to look into the future, to anticipate problems. They solve problems as soon as they come, but they don't anticipate them. They are not able to see the future. Nobody could anticipate that the Hamas could be victorious in the Gaza Strip. Nobody anticipated that Russia could be victorious in Ukraine. And now that's a reality. This inability to assess the enemy beyond the use of a narrative is what weakens the West. And you have exactly the same thing. Again, we are back. I'm not an expert in AI, but still we are exactly with the same problem with DeepSeek. And now what happens is that we see that the Chinese are more successful in developing new technologies in a more efficient manner than we do. So what we try to do is to suppress these new challenges, and we do that also by developing censorship and trying to block what is said on Twitter. And when Meta and Twitter say they will drop any kind of censorship on their platform, then everybody is crying, because the narrative and maintaining the narrative is giving us the illusion of success. But the fact of the matter is that by protecting the narrative, the only result is that we protect our incapability of developing things. We protect our market, we protect our behavior, we protect our strategies so they are not challenged in any way, and therefore we implement losing strategies because we don't accept the challenge. But there is a point where the reality confronts the narrative, and then you see exactly what we are witnessing today in Gaza and what we see in Ukraine, that your narrative cannot be powerful enough to challenge the reality. And that's exactly where we fail. And we will continue to fail because we think we are superior. We think we are better. We think we are this and that, and it's not true. And that's exactly what we are experiencing now. That's exactly what the US is experiencing. And probably in the coming months, days, years, that will affect severely our economies and our abilities to, or our credibility at large, let's put it that way.
Colonel, before wrapping up this session, if you remember before the war in Iraq, and Netanyahu was talking about if we overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that's gonna bring a huge change in that region in favor of Israel, in favor of the United States, which wasn't the case. And do you see that Turkey is replacing Iraq of those days? And in those days, they had two, in the mind of Israelis, at least Netanyahu, there were two enemies, Iran and Iraq. And the priority was Iraq. And even with the war between Iran and Iraq, if you remember, Israelis they wanted these two nations fighting each other. And this war continue in favor of, because they thought that would benefit Israel in a long run. Here comes the question, with all those changes happening right now, is Israel in a better position? Is Israel capable even to fight Iran directly without the United States? Because at the end of the day, you have to understand the reality of what's going on around you to make decisions. With the situation in Syria, fall of Assad, they were so happy, we are victorious, Iran is out, Russia is out, and that could solve the situation for the benefit of Israelis.
Well, the Israelis had always in mind, or they has this vision that the more the Arab world is split, the less it's a threat against Israel. Probably based on history, they assessed that if the Arabs would fight each other, they would not spend too much time fighting against Israel. And if they would do so, it's easier to fight a small enemy than a bigger one. And what you had in the 60s with huge, big countries that were the result of the end of the Ottoman Empire and the decolonization of the World War II, with Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Iran, those huge countries. And Israel considered always them, they always considered their neighbors as enemies. Also because they have ambitions that contain territory of their enemies or their neighbors. The greater Israel, in fact, in theory, for certain Israelis, the greater Israel goes from the Nile to the Euphrates, which means that it would affect a number of their current neighbors. So the permanent idea of the Israelis was to break down these countries into smaller entities that fight each other. Now, and in that sense, exactly what we had in Syria, that not just last year, but what we had in 2011, that's something that started, in fact, by Israel. That's very much the implementation of an Israeli strategy with the help of the US and all that. Same thing with Iraq, as you rightly mentioned. Now, Iran is a little bit different because Iran has been considered for a very long time as an ally of Israel, not just because of the Shah, but because the all other neighbors, I mean, all the neighbors of Israel are basically Sunni country, and Iran is a Shiite country. And therefore, they considered that this big power in the Middle East, which is Iran, could be kind of a counterweight for the Sunni threat, if you when and in fact, you never had direct issues between Iran and Israel. You never had issues, in essence. When Hezbollah was created in 1985, it was this idea that it was supported by Iran and all that, but there was a support from Iran because it's a Shiite community. But again, Hezbollah is essentially a defensive organization, mainly that it's absolutely no threat whatsoever against Israel. It becomes a threat to Israel because Israel is trying to invade South Lebanon, because again, Lebanon is considered as part of Israel. So we are back to the basics. But in essence, Iran has absolutely no grievance against Israel. Israel maintained this kind of, I would say, a fake enemy with Iran, because Iran is the declared enemy of, or US decided that Iran is the enemy. And one key aspect of Israeli security policy since the 50s is to try to have the US involved in the region. But since the US has developed good relationships with Egypt, with Jordan, probably today with Syria, and of course they toppled Saddam Hussein. As a result, Iraq is probably not a friend, but at least is considered as less as an enemy than before. Iran remains the only possible enemy for Israel that could be used as a leverage to force US into the region. That's the issue. Iran has never had any problem. They have no territorial problems. They have no political issues. They are far away from each other. There is no, and every time you had, like we had last year in October and in April, we had this exchange of missiles. This was because of Israel provocation, and Israel is performing a terrorist attack in Iran since decades, and all the issue of nuclear weapons of Iran is, as everybody knows, that it has never been an issue really. And we have reports on reports that say that Iran has not nuclear weapons, is not working on nuclear weapons, and have seen even reports from the Israeli intelligence that says so. So it's only the political leadership that tries to maintain Iran as a threat because it's a justification for them to have the same enemy as the US. This is the only purpose. Now, the problem is that this vision of having a kind of divided Arab states and all that, that could have been a solution in the 50s or 60s. But today, this vision is totally outdated. And we have seen that with Syria, because at the end of the day, they toppled a president that was secular, that wanted a secular country, that never had any ambitions to attack Israel and all that. He tried, as the father Hafez al-Assad, to have a political settlement about the Golan Heights, as it was about to come in 2000, just before you had Ariel Sharon coming and all that. So you had these, but the Syrians had a very, very cautious approach towards Israel. But for some reason, Israel stick to this kind of vision that Syria should be split into 3 separate countries and all that. So they continue that. And as a result, today they have an Islamist government there, supported by Turkey. The advantage of having Turkey, regardless of how we assess Turkey, whether they want to reconstruct the Ottoman Empire and all that, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that Turkey is a country which has strong institutions, that has no interest in starting wars with anybody. What we have seen, in fact, with Turkey is that it's also a country, because of the presence of the Kurds and all that. There were some attempts to destabilize Turkey, in fact. That's the reason why Turkey opposed, at that time, the idea of George W. Bush to attack Iraq, because Turkey understood perfectly at that time that destabilizing Iraq would create an empty space for the Kurds and therefore increase the Kurdish threat on Turkey. And that's why they opposed. But US didn't want to listen. They created the problem, and that created a problem for Turkey. And by destabilizing Syria, you had exactly the same thing, that the Kurds started to create some kind of a Kurdish state in the east of Syria, which has historically never been Kurdish, never. But now they can have some sanctuaries that help, especially the PKK, which changed name, but basically when you talk about the SDF, I don't remember the exact name, Syrian Democratic Forces, something like that. and the PKK. In fact, it's exactly the same organization. And the Kurds used the SDF as kind of a sanctuary to send or to support the revolutionary movement in Turkey. Therefore, that obliged Turkey to create a buffer zone. That means to intervene in Syria, to have this pocket in Idlib, but also in the northern part of Syria, you have a strip of land that has been created as a buffer zone by the Turks. But and all that is the result of Western policies in the region. Had the U.S. not attacked Iraq, we know that it was. We don't even understand today what was the purpose of that. We don't even know today what was the purpose of trying to destabilize Syria. And again, these are kind of erratic decisions by the West to destabilize such country, but that was promoted by Israel, and that's probably the only rationale we have. Today you have Turkey, which in my view must be, even if it might have expansionist temptations, let's say, I would say Turkey is a stabilizing factor in the region. That's my personal view. And I don't know exactly how the new Syrian government will develop, and it will develop its relationship with the neighbors, including Israel. I don't know. What we have seen so far is that this new government tries to be relatively conciliatory with both the Russians, Iran, Turkey. I don't know if it will last. Let's give them a chance to do so. At the end of the day, we have to work with those who are in place, regardless whether or not we consider the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham as a terrorist organization or things like this. At the end of the day, if we, again, I'm not a supporter of the way that the Syrian government was changed in December last year. But on the other hand, we have to go beyond those qualification of terrorists and all that. If we would use that, Israel would be a terrorist state because it was created by terrorists through terrorism. Let's be clear. So nobody would talk to Israelis. So if we were able to talk to Israeli terrorists, we can be able to talk to Palestinian terrorists or other terrorists, and therefore this word terrorist doesn't mean much at the end of the day. So that's a reality of things. This is kind of realpolitik again. So the policy based on reality, regardless of doctrinal, ideological issues related to that. So let's give a chance to this new government. They are in power. Let's see how they can develop. My view is that the problem in the Middle East is the way Israel behaves. And the more it behaves in contravention to the international law, the way it behaves by killing children, women, and all that, that is the reason why everybody wants Israel to be away from this region. That's the reason. It's not because they are Jews. It's because they misbehave. That's the reason. And therefore, regardless of how you describe the various governments, including Syria and all that, at the end of the day, we will have to work with them. And at the end of the day, if we want them to remain, let's say, peaceful, we should make sure that Israel remains peaceful as well. Because so far, you can see every single conflict that we had in the past 80 years in the region, every single one was started by Israel. Every single one. So this is the real problem. I mean, Israel is the problem. That's a little bit sad to say so, but it's a real. I mean, today you have Israeli politicians, they start realizing that. Today you have some countries realizing that. And I think that's probably the outcome of the Operation Al-Aqsa Flood that was launched on the 7th of October 2023 by Palestinians, not just Hamas, but Palestinians. And that highlights that, in fact, what happened since then just highlights the fact that Israel is not a country that behaves like a normal country. It doesn't behave like a country that respects the rule of law. We talked, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. The word democracy, I don't know exactly what that means, because every country has its own understanding and perception of democracy. You know, if you look at Switzerland and we look at France, which is neighbor, they have totally different understanding of democracy. In my view, I'm a Swiss, and when I look at France, I say it's a kind of a electoral monarchy. It's not a democracy whatsoever. The only element that makes them a democracy is that they elect the president. That's all. For the rest, it's just a monarchy. So, but they call themselves democracy. So democracy doesn't mean much. Rule of law, that's a different thing. Because the rule of law means that you have a set of law and you work according to this set of law. And this is objective. There's nothing that can be subject to interpretation there. Either you abide by law or you don't. And when we say the rule of law, it's not just national law, it's also international law. So you can call Israel democracy, whatever. The fact of the matter is that country that doesn't work according to the rule of law. And in fact, abiding by the rule of law is a key fundamental of the word democracy. Democracy is not just because people vote. Democracy is because you rule based on the rule of law. That's why the French can call themselves democracy and the Swiss can call themselves democracy, because both work based on the rule of law. But then the Swiss vote every 3 months, while the French every 4 years or so. You know, so that's. But the rule of law is the key element that defines democracy, and Israel doesn't work based on the rule of law, meaning it doesn't even fulfill the criteria of democracy. So regardless of how you can call them the first, the best, the whatever democracy in the Middle East, the fact of the matter is that it doesn't even have the first element of the criteria of the democracy, which is working according to the rule of law. And that's it. We are there. And everybody understands that today, I think. Even those who deny it, they understand that. Of course, you have all countries that needs to find kind of a rhetoric in order to bypass or to distort the law, like Annalena Baerbock, who said that you have the right to destroy a population if you have terrorists hiding in a population. You know, exactly what his ancestors used to say in Eastern Europe in 1941. Exactly, she has exactly the same wording. Exactly the same wording. Now, since 1946, with the Nuremberg Tribunal, we know that a civilian population is a civilian population, and you have to preserve a civilian population. That becomes law, and therefore, if you deny this, if you refuse this, then you are not working according to the rule of law, and you don't have the right to use the word democracy. Simply.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kamal, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you very much.